So as I've mentioned, it's a series of webinars that we're having. The objective of the webinars is really to familiarize parties with the CITES NDF guidance, that the preliminary guidance that was agreed by the Animals and Plants Committee in 2024, and to explain to you and highlight some of the key modules, key concepts and templates that are available for parties to use. We would like to encourage parties to make use of the guidance and to develop case studies of its application, and then to share those with the Secretariat or with other parties as you see fit, so that we can all learn from the guidance that has been developed, and especially to see how we can make further improvements to the guidance. It's an opportunity for you to ask questions. So as I mentioned, please feel free to ask questions during the session, especially to get clarification, or if you would like to share your experiences that in terms of implementing or using the guidance already, you are more than welcome to share the experiences that you have to date. We're going to discuss a few case studies as an illustration of how to apply the guidance. As you know, there are different modules, but there are also templates provided in one of the modules. And we use those templates to show how you can apply the guidance, taking into consideration that there are various different approaches that parties use to do the NDFs. But we'll go through a few case studies using the simplified assessment as well as comprehensive assessments. And again, please feel free to ask questions. Then the overall aim is to initiate the learning process and to get feedback for future improvements to the guidance. In terms of the program or agenda for the webinar, it's basically divided into 3 parts. The first part is we will do an introduction, overview of CITES and NDFs, the NDF project, and then the different modules and other capacity building tools that's available. We will take a short break after the main presentation before we go forward with the discussion on the NDF case studies of practical examples. And then the last part 3, will be next steps, where we talk about a little bit about field testing, feedback mechanisms, proposed decisions that will be considered by the COP, and hopefully future updates that we can make. The content of the presentation follows the same structure. We'll start with an overview of understanding NDFs and the provisions of the text of the convention, the NDF project that resulted in the modules that we have to date. And then we'll look at the actual guidance, the overall structure, the generic guidance that includes 2 modules, the thematic modules and supporting modules, and as I mentioned, capacity building opportunities and next steps. So starting off with understanding NDFs, as we all know, non-detriment findings is one of the pillars of the convention. It's a key legal requirement in terms of the text of the convention. And so we'll start by just reflecting on key provisions in the text of the convention that relates to non-detriment findings. So as you are familiar, Article 3 regulates the international trade in Appendix 1 listed species. So trade only should occur in exceptional circumstances, while Article 4 regulates the trade in Appendix 2 listed species, where commercial trade can take place. Both of these articles require that the scientific authority should advise whether the trade is not detrimental to the survival of that species. And while in Article 3 for Appendix 1 listed species, the scientific authority has the added responsibility to also advise on whether the import will be for a purpose that will not be detrimental to the survival of the species in the wild. In terms of Appendix 2 listed species, especially because commercial trade can take place if the scientific authority advises that it's not detrimental, also requires that the scientific authority should monitor the exports of specimens of Appendix 2 listed species And whenever it's necessary and they have concerns about the levels of trade, it should advise the management authority about measures that it can take to ensure that exports are limited, with the aim to ensure that this species can be maintained throughout its range at a level consistent with the role of the species in the ecosystem. And of course, above the level that it might become eligible for inclusion in Appendix 1. So we will discuss during the session a little bit about the role of the species in the ecosystem and the guidance that have been developed in terms of that. But this monitoring requirements is especially important for Appendix 2 as commercial trade can take place, if not detrimental. Both Article 3 and 4 also requires that introduction from the sea should requires the making of a non-detriment finding. And as you know, for Appendix 3 listed species, which include species included by specific parties, a non-detriment finding is not required. You might have heard some key concepts already in terms of the text of the convention, and we thought we'll focus on a few in the next slide. The first one is overexploitation, that is referred to in the preambular text of the convention, and it relates to the fact that the parties recognize that international cooperation is essential for the protection of certain species and to ensure that there's no overexploitation through international trade. The other concept is threatened with extinction, and that is a link to the fundamental principles contained in the text of the convention, and specifically in terms of the species included in Appendix 1 and 2, with Appendix 1 that includes species threatened with extinction, which are or may be affected by trade, and Appendix 2 listed species which, although not necessarily now threatened with extinction, may become so unless trade in the specimens is strictly regulated to avoid utilization incompatible with their survival. So those are some of the key concepts in terms of not detrimental to the survival of that species, as I already mentioned in Article 3 and 4, that is specifically referred to, and we refer to that in short as non-detriment findings that are required.
You were at that meeting. That was in the middle of November.
It was in November.
If I can,
very good meeting.
Sorry, I'll just mute participants as I go. But just a kind request to please mute yourself when you join the meeting. I already mentioned for Article 3 that the scientific authority should also ensure that the purpose of the import of Appendix 1 listed species is also not detrimental to the survival of the species in the wild, and the requirement for monitoring where the scientific authority can then propose management measures to ensure that the species is maintained throughout its range at a level consistent with its role in the ecosystem. And then Article 13 includes some compliance measures or international measures where the Secretariat, if provided with information and there's concerns relating to either the implementation of the convention in terms of meeting the obligations in the convention, or there's concerns about the levels of trade, there is a process agreed by the CITES parties in terms of looking at corrective measures. I think in the science unit, the parties are familiar with the review of significant trade process in 12.8, which is one measure that ensures that provides a safety net for us to ensure that parties are implementing Article 4 and making non-detriment findings in terms of trade in wild species. So those are the key concepts that I wanted to highlight to you. And then overall, the focus, of course, of our session is on non-detriment findings. And as you've seen in the text of the convention, it's advice that the scientific authority is providing with the aim of ensuring that the trade is not detrimental to the survival of the species in the wild. This advice is basically a decision that must be made by the scientific authority, and the management authority should not issue permits in the absence of this advice or decision by the scientific authority. And as mentioned already, Appendix 3 doesn't require NDFs. it's important to reflect a little bit on some of the key resolutions that are relevant to non-detriment findings. And the most important one, of course, is Resolution Conf 16.7 on non-detriment findings. This resolution, although it addresses one of the key requirements in the convention and one of the pillars of the convention, it was only adopted about 38 years after the convention came into force. But rather late than never. It took some time to agree the recommendations in the resolution, and so this resolution provides the guidance agreed by parties, and it recommends concepts and non-binding principles in terms of non-detriment findings and methodologies. We extracted a few in this slide, but I encourage you to ensure that you are familiar with the contents of this resolution, in addition to the modules that have been developed with additional guidance. A key requirement is that NDF should result from a science-based risk assessment. And of course, this can take many forms. It can be written advice from the scientific authority, verbal advice from the scientific authority, and a lot of times parties use quotas that's based on a non-detriment finding for a specific period of time. So quotas, and you'll see on the website, voluntary established quotas, national established quotas, as well as the compulsory quotas that have been put in place by various processes. Although the advice can be both written or verbal, the resolution encouraged parties to ensure that they keep records of written advice that has been provided for record purposes in terms of authorization or positive advice or negative advice relating to the trade. This resolution also points out that the complexity of the assessment and the data requirements should be proportionate to the vulnerability of the species. So species with a higher risk, high trade volumes, the requirements and data requirements and assessment requirements should be stricter. In this regard, I just want to point out that the vulnerability of the species has been expanded by the Conference of Parties, especially in Resolution Conf 9.24, where this is further unpacked in terms of the intrinsic and extrinsic factors that might impact the vulnerability of the species. So you can also consult that, where, for example, intrinsic factors relate to life history, where, for example, species with low fecundity, slow growth rate, high age of first maturity, and long generation times could be more vulnerable than others that do not have those characteristics. And of course, extrinsic characteristics that should be considered as things like vulnerability in terms of selectivity of removal, issues around alien invasive species, habitat fragmentation, and loss and disease issues that can all have an impact on the species. So that should also be considered when you consider the vulnerability of the species. The resolution recommends general criteria or aspects that should be taken into consideration when you do an assessment. And this includes things like species biology, the range, the distribution of the species, the population structure, the status of the population, trends in the population, also, of course, the threats to the population and whether that is also linked to extrinsic factors and things like illegal trade. It includes consideration of issues around the levels or patterns of harvest and trade. And just to keep in mind that, of course, you have to consider both illegal and legal trade. You also have to consider domestic use and issues around natural mortalities, etc. It also includes that you need to consider management measures and look at what monitoring systems are in place and overall conservation status of the species. So all this information is already contained in the resolution to give you guidance in terms of what to consider. And through the NDF guidance that have been developed, this was further elaborated and given some examples, etc., for your use. The resolution also recommends sources of information that can be considered. And in this regard, it's not only scientific literature and things like surveys, etc., but also the consideration of local knowledge and expertise of local and indigenous communities, etc. Issues around engaging other scientific authorities to obtain further information, consultation sessions, etc. So the sources of information is varied, and depending on the species that's involved, all of those options could be explored by the scientific authority. As I mentioned, it also encourages sharing of information between scientific authorities, but also with the CITES Secretariat. And so we encourage scientific authorities or parties to share information with the Secretariat on their non-detriment findings, and especially for us to then make it available on the CITES website. So we have been asked in this resolution to maintain a database on non-detriment findings, and if time allows, we will show you through a live demonstration how to access that and how to use the system to get more information on NDFs. There are also other key resolutions that we wanted to highlight. The one on management of nationally established quotas, ResConf 14.7. And I want to highlight especially that when export quotas are established, they should be set based on a non-detriment finding. So a quota does not replace the need for a non-detriment finding, but a quota should be informed by a non-detriment finding, which then, of course, as a management tool, allows you to monitor those levels of offtake, and you can make adjustments as needed. Resolution 10.3 on designation and role of scientific authorities is also important. The webinar especially focused on scientific authorities and sharing this information with scientific authorities. And this resolution required that scientific authorities should be designated, but it also sets out the roles and responsibilities of the scientific authority that include a number of issues, and it also encourages engagements between different scientific authorities, and especially in neighboring states where there's a shared resource that is also encouraged. Then resolution con 13.2 on sustainable use of biodiversity. This refers to the Addis Ababa principles and guidelines for the sustainable use of biodiversity that encourages parties and countries to take into account scientific, trade, and enforcement considerations determined by national circumstances in informing decision making. Two principles that I want to highlight that's very relevant to what we will also hear today is the principle 4, which speaks to adaptive management, where through the Addis Ababa principles, parties are encouraged to practice adaptive management, and we'll hear more of that later. And then principle 5, which indicates that sustainable use management goals and practices should avoid or minimize adverse impacts on ecosystem services. And because we are reflecting on the role of the species in the ecosystem, that is also very relevant. But just two that I wanted to highlight in short. But of course, there are additional resolutions and decisions that might be relevant, and you can access all of those on the CITES website. Now, the CITES NDF project, the project was initiated a few years ago, so it's taken some time and a lot of collaboration and engagements with various stakeholders to come up with the draft preliminary guidance that we have at the moment. But it's basically was done in 4 phases. The first phase started after COP18 in 2019. When inventory was done on what NDF guidance materials are available, what tools are there for parties to use, and a gap analysis was done to inform the development of NDF guidance. After COP19, that then informed the process, but after COP19, a technical advisory group was established. This was chaired by the chair of the Animals and the Plants Committee, and had representative of the Animals and Plants Committee, the Standing Committee, the donor community, but also representatives from organizations. And this is an illustration of how the NDF guidance have been developed through a collaborative process that involved a wide variety and range of stakeholders. So both party representatives and experts, but also experts, individual experts and experts from organizations. So the tag provided oversight in terms of the development process, and specific work streams were defined based on the gap analysis that was done. And you can see there 11 work streams were formed to develop the guidance based on the gap analysis. The only aspect that could not be covered was amphibians, and so that was on the list as one of the gaps, but that did not have a work stream in the end due to some constraints. Then so the work streams worked, each of the work streams had a lead to coordinate and to assist in terms of drafting the guidance. And that resulted in draft guidance that was then taken to the International Expert Workshop that took place in December 2023 in Nairobi, where the final drafts were then given, produced through inputs through that process. We are currently in phase 4, where we're rolling out the guidance, doing some field testing, and where we hope to get some feedback to see how useful the guidance is for parties and how we can improve the guidance going forward. So the International Expert Workshop in Nairobi was attended by more than 150 participants from 42 parties, so it was very well represented. There were also 25 organizations. Thanks to the donors, we could support some delegates to attend. And we appreciate also the work done by the IUCN throughout this process as our implementing partner. So through this process, the draft modules were further elaborated, further discussions took place, and that resulted in the modules that we will be presenting today. The preliminary NDF guidance is available on the CITES website. I'll show you just now how to find them, and they're available in English, French, and Spanish. Except for the module with the case studies, that is only available in English because it's quite lengthy and we didn't have adequate resources to translate all the case studies as well. So that is available in English, but all the other modules are available in English, French, and Spanish. So just a quick navigation on the CITES website, how to find it. There are two ways to find it. One is by clicking on topics at the top tabs. There's a list of tabs there, either through under topics or implementation. So if you click on topics under cross-cutting issues, you'll find non-detriment findings. And then if you get to the page on non-detriment findings, you have to scroll down a little bit past all the resolutions and various other information. And then you'll see the guidance. It looks like this. With the module 0, the introduction, generic guidance, and the thematic modules, as well as the supporting modules available on the website. So just a quick navigation on where you can find it if you have not had time to look at it. And in terms of the structure, as mentioned, there's a general introduction module that Thomasina will speak to in more detail. We have 2 generic modules, one on what is a NDF, and the second one on how to do an NDF. And we have 9 thematic modules covering the specific areas that were identified as gaps from local and traditional knowledge to birds, reptiles, tree species, invertebrates, etc. So please have a look at these modules, and we will introduce them throughout this session. And we will appreciate any feedback on how you find the use of these modules in terms of informing your processes. And then, of course, there's also supporting modules, online tools that are available at the moment. We have templates in module 13, and we'll demonstrate the templates through the case studies later on. There are a number of case studies available in module 14, and then a glossary of key terms and definitions. And just a reminder that this glossary supplements the CITES glossary. So we already have a CITES glossary, but this module 15 includes terms that's maybe not in the CITES glossary at the moment. We call the preliminary guidance 1.1 because we are in the field testing process, and we are encouraging parties to use it and give us feedback with the aim to improve it. So we will have other versions going forward, 1.2, maybe 1.3, as the guidance evolve based on the inputs. But we wanted to highlight that the guidance is not legally binding on parties, and it's not intended to be prescriptive. And so we know that parties might already be using other approaches, methodologies to make their non-detriment findings, and that is perfectly fine. And we hope that maybe in the guidance that we have here, there might be some other additional approaches that you could consider to supplement what you're doing, or if you have an area of uncertainty, you can always cross-reference it. But you are more than welcome to continue to use the processes that you have in place. And then furthermore, of course, the guidance is meant to be flexible, and parties can adapt it to the elements that are important in your specific context and needs that you have and your own circumstances. So just to emphasize, it's not legally binding. You're welcome to continue to use the processes that you have if they're working for you, and it's supposed to be flexible. And we're going to welcome any feedback that you have on using this specific guidance to see how we can improve it. And if you have examples of how you've adapted your guidance, taking into consideration the modules, you're welcome to share those experiences. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to Thomasina, who will be taking you through the respective modules. So over to you, Thomasina.
Great, thanks, Tia. I will just try and get the presentation up. Can everyone see that?
I have a question from someone, Thomasina. So at the moment, I can't see the presentation.
I also can't see Thomasina, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm gonna
Right.
ask Vanessa from Tonga. If you have a question, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify one thing. For the guidance for the NDF, if the party does not have a guidance in place or database for NDF, we can definitely use that as a reference or follow the guidance to direct us. I'm just making sure we're not like sort of like copyright or something.
No. So the guidance, absolutely, the guidance is there for you to use. So if you do not have anything, you can use the guidance that's available in the modules. And you'll see there are also templates that we will go through at the end, towards the second part of the session. We'll show you how to use the templates that are available. So no, you're more than welcome to use it. There's no copyright issues. This is the tool that is made available for parties to use. And we'll also, Thomasina will reflect a little bit in terms of where other tools are also available, because we know there are existing tools. So yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, Tia, for your great introduction to NDFs. And I'm going to carry on by introducing the different modules in the guidance, as Tia already said. And just please do put your hand up and stop me if there's anything that's unclear or ask questions. But we'll stop at the end of the guidance introduction, and hopefully people can ask questions then, which might be easier if we can take lots of questions at the same time. Okay, so module 0, which hopefully you can all see on screen. This module is the introduction and preamble to the whole guidance, and essentially it reminds people about the provisions of the convention. So it goes through quite a lot of the things that Tia has just introduced, the different provisions within convention, the different resolutions, etc. So it helps to give some background to the process of the CITES NDF project as well, and reminds you of some important considerations of using the guidance. Tia just mentioned the fact that it's not binding, the guidance, it's there to help parties in undertaking non-detriment findings. It's not supposed to be prescriptive. And if you're using different approaches already that you're finding work well for you, there's no need to change that. However, this guidance might also help with augmenting some of the information that you're working with. It also reminds parties that in some cases, some parties have implemented stricter domestic measures, and this in no way alters the rights of those parties to implement those stricter domestic measures. Article 14 of the Convention on Effect of Domestic Legislation and International Conventions specifically says that the provisions of the present convention shall in no way affect the right of parties to adopt stricter domestic measures regarding conditions for trade, taking, possession or transport of specimens of species in the appendices. So this module also gives a review of the overall structure of the NDF guidance. Next slide, please. So hopefully you can all see Module 1, Principles and Concepts of NDFs on your screen. So Module 1 introduces within the guidance types of risk, including intrinsic vulnerability of species and life history characteristics, which Tia talked about earlier, and the fact that data requirements should be proportional to the risks identified through those vulnerability characteristics of species. It also talks about a precautionary approach, and taking a precautionary approach doesn't mean that if there are any risks identified that a positive NDF cannot be made, or that the trade or harvest needs to be halted. It's stated in Annex 4 of Resolution 9.24 that in the case of uncertainty, either regarding the status of the species or the impact of the trade on the conservation of the species, that parties should act in the best interest of the conservation of the species concerned and adopt measures that are proportionate to the anticipated risks to the species. So this module talks quite a bit about taking a precautionary approach, but how you can do that within your NDFs. Another issue covered is that with making a non-detriment finding might come some conditions, some safeguards and management measures that reduce the risks and uncertainties and increase the probability that non-detriment is achieved in harvest and trade. So various examples are included. There's a long table which is particularly useful of some of the conditions or management measures you could take or include with your non-detriment findings. So they might include things like having a quota, or having sex or size limits, or having a closed season during breeding times. So there's really useful information there on things that you might want to include. Tia also mentioned earlier about the requirement to look at the impact on the role of the species in their ecosystems. And that is considered in some detail in Module 1. There's also guidance on how to deal with situations where there is low data availability. We've already talked about risks and uncertainties and the precautionary approach, but it gives some potential information sources on dealing with low data availability and also with limited capacity, and how you can build capacity, how you can engage with others, potentially academics, universities, etc., to help build your capacity and knowledge on the species you're dealing with. And then it also talks about adaptive management. And Tia mentioned adaptive management in relation to the Addis Ababa principles and guidelines earlier. But essentially, adaptive management is learning by doing. It's a tool that enables you to consider and address risks, precaution, and safeguards, but particularly on times when you have low data and limited capacity. So you may start with a low availability of knowledge. You might then commence a limited harvest or trade, monitor the effect, and then adapt or adjust your management and trade levels in response to the monitoring. And this is a circular system where the monitoring feeds into adapting, and then you start again and evaluate. So a very useful tool, particularly when you don't have perfect information. Next slide, please. So Module 2 takes you into more practical considerations for non-detriment findings. Module 1 gave some theoretical background, and Module 2 takes you into more practical guidance. It gives an overall generic framework for making NDFs. And here you can see a schematic overview of what's included. So if you look at the box that says start here, you're always going to start with some initial information gathering, whatever species you're looking at. And then one option is to do a simplified assessment. And if through this simplified assessment, you can easily conclude that the trade is non-detrimental, you don't need any more information, and you can make your conclusion. However, if through this simplified assessment, it concludes that actually more information is required in order to determine detriment or non-detriment, then you would be directed to go to a comprehensive assessment. You don't have to go through a simplified assessment. You can go straight to a comprehensive assessment if you know that your species is not going to be a very straightforward one. So after you've undertaken your assessment, you make that conclusion and decision, and along with it, potentially conditions and management advice. And that's the end of your non-detriment finding. However, as we've just talked about adaptive management, then if there are conditions or management advice that are included with your decision, then those need to be implemented, and we get into the adaptive management loop, which will then feed into non-detriment findings in the future. So Module 13 gives some templates for undertaking these different assessments. Some other things to note in this module are some guidance on looking at the geographic focus of assessments, on the frequency or periodicity of making non-detriment findings, how often should they be being made, some further information on non-detriment findings and the relationship with quotas, as well as guidance on how to make NDFs for specimens of different source codes. There's a useful table in there. Next slide, please. So here are those different steps described in a bit more detail. We talked about the different steps just now, but the initial data gathering is looking at background checks to review the basic information about what the specimens in trade are, whether and what type of NDF is necessary, and whether you should be thinking of going to a simplified or comprehensive assessment. As I said, the simplified assessment is optional, but really only for undertaking where it's likely to be easy to establish whether harvesting for trade is non-detrimental. Again, comprehensive assessment, you would undertake this when it's not possible to determine non-detriment based on a simplified assessment. And you can do that with or without undertaking a simplified assessment first. And then you come to your conclusion or decision. The final NDF decision may include conditions or management advice. And then, as we also discussed, we have this adaptive management loop that feeds back through the process. Next slide, please. So at the start of your NDF process, when a scientific authority is asked to make an NDF, there's going to be initial data information gathering, some basic background to the species. Is it correctly identified and named? If you don't have this information, you're not going to be able to be sure that the information you're basing your NDF on is correct or relevant. And just double checking that the species is listed in Appendix 1 or 2. It's going to be very different depending on which. And this third question, is the species exempted or excluded from CITES controls? Some species have annotations which specifically include or exclude different parts and products in trade. So it may be that the export is requested for something that's not included, in which case you wouldn't have to do an NDF. So useful just to recheck that. And this then also checking whether there have been any recommendations to suspend trade, potentially through various CITES processes. You're going to want to know what the quantity of specimens being exported is, what kind of specimens they are, whether it's trade in whole animals or parts or timber, etc. And also what the source of specimens is. I spoke just a minute ago about the fact that there's a table looking at the source codes and how one makes NDFs for specimens where the source code is different. You might have a wild source code, but you might have ranched or captive bred or artificially propagated. And there's guidance on that. So it's useful to ensure you know what you're making your NDF on. Understanding what the purpose of exports is, as we said, particularly important when you're thinking about Appendix 1 and for imports. Understanding where the specimens are harvested from or will be harvested from if they're not harvested yet is useful in terms of knowing what areas things are coming out of and defining the scale of your NDF. And then knowing whether you're doing an NDF on a particular area or doing it for the national population as a whole. And then finally, just a check on national legislation. This isn't doing a legal acquisition finding, but it's understanding whether there is national legislation or regulations that can help understand potential detriment to harvesting or extinction risks. Next slide, please. So, Module 2, the simplified assessment. So this was originally developed with reptiles in mind and can be used in really low risk situations, which means that scientific authorities can concentrate their time and their efforts on the less straightforward NDFs. This means you can get through the easy ones fairly quickly and justify your decision. There are 5 aspects that are looked at separately. The first being annual harvest level, and note that this is harvest level, not trade level. It should consider all harvest, whether for domestic or international trade, and should be considered including the losses, the potential losses that happen through harvesting or production. So the total harvest. A low score will be highly taxon specific and strongly related to the size of the population. For example, a catch of 40 anguillid glass eels would be considered low, whereas 40 lions would likely be considered quite high. So it's going to be dependent on your species. The second part looks at area of distribution, and there's more guidance given in this module on how you can consider that and looking at areas of occupancy, etc. The third criterion looks at what is the species life history. As we talked about earlier, there are certain vulnerabilities with different life history characteristics. So would it be considered to have a fast or a slow life history, or you can look at it alternatively, would it have a R-selected, is it an R-selected species with early maturity, being short-lived, producing larger numbers of offspring, versus a K-selected or a slow life history species with late maturity, long-lived, greater parental investment in offspring. The fourth criteria is what's the conservation status? And scoring is based on whether the species is threatened. This could be based on the IUCN Red List or equivalents for other assessments, such as being overfished or depleted. So if the species is threatened, if it's considered vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, etc., you would score this a 1. And also where species have not been assessed or there isn't enough information to make an assessment, so it would be unknown or data deficient, this also gives a score of 1. And then finally, illegal trade. If illegal trade is well known, the level of trade is well known or can be estimated, you consider that with your annual harvest level. However, the very fact of illegal trade is quite often you don't know the levels, but if you do know that it is going on, then you would score this a 1. So when you add up the final score in your simplified assessment, if it is lower than 5, i.e. 1 to 4, you can consider that the trade is non-detrimental, and you record that and justify it in the worksheet. But if it's 5 or higher, then it's suggested that actually you need to do a more comprehensive assessment and need more information in order to determine whether the trade will be non-detrimental or not. So that was the simplified assessment. I'm moving on to the next slide. I hope you can see Module 2, Comprehensive Assessment Risk Evaluation. Great. Okay. So the comprehensive assessment is in 2 parts. The first part is risk evaluation, and the second part is impact and management evaluation. So this first part looking at risk evaluation takes into account the species biology, life history, and the characteristics that might make a species vulnerable to overexploitation. Then other factors that are considered are the species range, both historic and current, looking at how widespread the species is, the population, and how stable things have been over time. Then it looks at population size, structure, and status, and goes on to look at conservation status, not just at the global level, but also at the national and local level, which might be more pertinent to the assessment. It considers other threats, other things that might make the species vulnerable or pose a risk to the species and to the harvesting. So understanding these risks determines how complex or simple information and data requirements should be in considering the next stage or assessment. The factors that are included in here are taken from those factors that Tia's already talked about in resolution 16.7, and just expands on those and how you might want to consider thinking about them, how you might assess them. There are various examples given to evaluate that. They're not exhaustive, so there might be, and they might not be completely appropriate to the species that you're thinking of, and they're just examples, so it's not, don't stick to it rigidly. The next slide is, and the next stage is of the comprehensive assessment is looking at impact and management evaluation. So again, this guidance suggests what you could consider in assessing each of these factors. So we have harvest impacts, looking at the total impacts as stated previously for the simplified assessment as well. And included in that is looking at illegal harvest. Trade impacts. Do we know what the trade impacts are at the harvest area? And nationally or even internationally, you need to be looking at total volume of trade as well. Population monitoring, is that in place? Are we sure that we know what the impacts are of the harvest? And looking at the frequency of that and whether that's being done appropriately to give you the information that you need to know in order to be sure of your decision on your non-detriment finding. It also looks at the management measures in place and also proposed, including whether there's adaptive management going on. So looking at these can help you understand whether it's likely that they're good enough to ensure sustainable or non-detrimental harvest. one thing to point out here is that on the right-hand side of the table, unknown is considered to be a higher risk. If you don't know any of these factors, then actually it's very difficult to be sure of whether you have a non-detriment. Could I ask that people mute their microphone? Sorry, thank you. So intrinsically, it's a kind of precautionary approach is built into this. If you don't know what you're dealing with, then it's difficult to be sure that it's non-detrimental. So the next slide, please, is comprehensive assessments, ecosystem impacts. I'm hoping that you can see that on your screen. As mentioned previously for Module 1, assessing ecosystem impacts, both in terms of direct impact on other species and on the ecosystems and the roles that the species play in the ecosystem, is really only recommended for high-risk situations. During the discussions through the work stream and in Nairobi, it was considered that the most pragmatic approach to thinking about the roles in the ecosystem, because very often there's little known about it, is that a pragmatic approach might be to assume that if there's a viable population, it's distributed over much of its range, and that it's being sustainably harvested, then a species' role in the relevant ecosystems is being maintained. However, for higher risk situations where you've determined that there are significant risks, there are ways to consider what the impacts might be, and this module goes into some detail about that. So there may be direct impacts on the species, on other species or the ecosystem, but there might also be indirect impacts because of the role that those species play in ecosystems. So that they might provide habitat for other species or critical food sources at different times for different species. And the harvest in one area might impact its roles in the ecosystem in other areas, different areas, may potentially even other populations and countries. So one needs to consider all the roles in the ecosystems in which the species occurs in its different life forms, life stages. So to give an example, harvest of glass eels taken from one country may have an impact on the availability of eels in subsequent life stages and their availability as prey for other species in another country. So that's considering a quite wide-ranging species. But as I said, you know, this does go into some detail on how to consider ecosystem impacts, but it's recommended that you can just look at those in terms of higher risk species. So going on to the next slide, Module 2, Conclusion Decision. Once you have brought all your information together, you have to take this decision. You have to make a conclusion. Is the trade not detrimental, or is it detrimental? Is it a positive NDF or a negative NDF. Or you may take the decision that there is insufficient information available to make a positive or negative NDF. Different parties have different terminology around this, but essentially it's a kind of yes or a no to we think this is non-detrimental. And as I said earlier, you may also make a decision that to give a non-detriment finding which has conditions. So conditions on the trade taking place or advice for the management authority. It may include conditions such as a more conservative export, or there may be management measures that could need to be put in place before a positive NDF would be made. And as I said earlier, there's more information on conditions and safeguards in Module 1, so I'd highly recommend referring back to that. Okay, on to the next slide, please. And this is looking at incorporating local and traditional knowledge and participatory species monitoring. So, as Tia mentioned, the NDF Resolution 16.7 recommends that when considering sources of information, they should not be limited to relevant scientific literature and expertise, but also include relevant knowledge and expertise of local and Indigenous communities. So this module looks at what local and traditional knowledge is, how it can be incorporated into non-detriment findings, and also how participatory species monitoring can help in the management of species and managing adaptively. So there are various case studies included in this this module. For instance, box E looks at multi-stakeholder engagement in setting hunting quotas in Zimbabwe. So there's a lot of information there on how you can include this knowledge into NDFs, and also how you can engage with others to monitor in participatory monitoring. On this slide, you have a table that shows the most relevant steps for local and traditional knowledge. And those are within the simplified assessment, within the comprehensive assessment of quite often local peoples have a lot more information on the history of exploitation and the populations, and all this can be fed into your assessments. And then it can also feed into monitoring and management post your NDF decision and the adaptive management side of things. There's one part of this table which is not ticked, and this is the conclusion or decision. So this is the responsibility of the scientific authority. Information can feed into that decision, but ultimately it's the scientific authority that's responsible for formulating that advice. Next slide, please. Module 4, NDFs for Appendix 1 imports. As Tia introduced earlier, the convention states that an import permit shall only be granted when specific conditions are met, which is that a scientific authority of the state of import has advised that the import will be for purposes which are not detrimental to the survival of the species involved for Appendix 1 listed species. So you'll all be familiar with purpose codes, and the scientific authority needs to consider whether import for that purpose code, that purpose, could be detrimental. This module also discusses other relevant resolutions where which touch on this issue as well. And then it's important to note that decisions by importing and exporting countries should be independent of each other. So the exporting country is making a non-detriment finding on the impact on the species in the wild, and whether that's detrimental, but the I think I got that the wrong way. The exporting country is making their NDF on the impact of the trade on the species population in the wild, whereas the importing country should be considering the purpose and whether that is detrimental to the survival of the species involved. Next slide, please. So now we're on to Module 5, NDFs for aquatic species. This module covers a wide range of species from marine invertebrates all the way up to sharks. So it gives some really useful information on where you can find databases, references to find lots of the information you'd be pulling into your non-detriment finding. It gives a very useful table that brings together considerations at different stages of the NDF assessment relevant to aquatic species. It which discusses species, methods and approaches to making NDFs. Often trade in aquatic species is in parts or products or by weight, and it's very useful to then use conversion factors to understand what the harvest and trade amounts are in terms of numbers of individuals of offtake. So this module discusses that in some depth. It talks about how to deal with non-target catch or incidental catch, bycatch, various different terms used around that. And also looks at where you have stocks which are transboundary or straddling, so they're in different jurisdictions. It also discusses species caught in areas beyond national jurisdiction, so where you have introduction from the sea, which, as Tia mentioned earlier, still requires a non-detriment finding by the country catching the I'm not going to go into detail on that and get muddled up with states there. It talks about, because quite often fisheries come under the jurisdiction of other bodies as well. There are roles to play in terms of regional fisheries bodies in helping to provide information in terms of the NDFs. And similarly, it presents some strategies for linking fisheries departments with CITES scientific authorities quite often. And I think this is similar for forestry departments. Your fisheries department and your forestry department may be very different to your nominated CITES scientific authorities. So this gives you some useful strategies for actually linking with the departments that are going to help you in terms of determining the NDF and providing a lot of the information that is going to be necessary to consider. It also looks at how to deal with ranched and captive born aquatic species. This is quite a typical issue with some aquatic species. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to highlight some things that have happened since the guidance was completed. One of which was there was a technical workshop on non-detriment findings for specimens of Appendix 2 species taken from areas beyond national jurisdiction. This was held in April in Geneva, and it gives some key recommendations and observations from the workshop, which are going to be appended to Module 5 in the future. It is available in Animals Committee 33 in Doc 1. And the Secretariat has also collaborated with the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute to develop a simplified 10-step NDF guidance for Queen Conch. And that can also be found in an AC33 document, Doc 43, Annex 3. On to the next slide, please. Module 6, NDFs for migratory species and transboundary populations. So, migratory species and transboundary populations may occur in 2 or more national jurisdictions. This makes the process of developing NDFs particularly complex, as scientific authorities should consider the potential impact of national take and use on the whole population of the species. So this module helps guide a scientific authority on multinational considerations, and particularly recommending the collaboration with other range states and sharing of information. It encourages the harmonisation of assessments to ensure that trade in the species will be non-detrimental throughout its range. And it gives methods and approaches to studying migratory species and transboundary populations, as well as how to apply a precautionary approach. It also looks at the roles of migratory and transboundary species in their ecosystems, which is particularly important as different life stages may exist in different jurisdictions, and harvesting in one country may have an impact on the species or on other species and ecosystems in another country. And just a note that obviously we've previously talked about aquatic species, which are often transboundary or migratory, and so useful to consider Module 5 and 6 together for some of those species as well. On to the next slide, please. Module 7, NDF for terrestrial invertebrates. So this module contains some really useful identification resources for invertebrates. Often these are some of the least known taxa and can be difficult to find information on. So this module helps direct people to looking for various information. The group also developed a decision tree for making simplified NDFs, and that can be seen on the next slide, please. So here is that decision tree, which incorporates some elements from the comprehensive evaluation. You'll spot here things around assessing the species size and distribution of the populations. So it's almost a bit of a hybrid between simplified assessment and pulls in some of the comprehensive issue assessment aspects as well. Module 8 for birds, please. Next slide. This module gives useful sources of information to help both simplified and comprehensive NDFs for birds, including specific guidance on how to score bird life history using generation length as a proxy. It suggests different survey methods for field monitoring and suggests management measures that can mitigate the impacts of harvest and trade. It looks at different functions that birds typically play in the ecosystem and that can be considered when if you need to try and assess roles, impact on the roles in the ecosystem. And it also has some key additional considerations for NDFs for birds with source codes C, D, and F. Next slide, please. Module 9, NDFs for reptiles. So this module gives some really useful information sources and methods and criteria that can help you implement both the simplified and the comprehensive NDFs. It gives comprehensive tables on common types of data useful for comprehensive NDFs for reptiles, common approaches used to obtain information, and common field-based approaches to measure population abundance and population structure of reptiles. It also gives a lot of background in understanding the quantitative thresholds for assessing annual harvest level and areas of distribution in simplified assessments for reptiles. So on to the next slide, please. Here is the simplified assessment of the first 3 criteria: harvest level, area of distribution, and life history, with some general quantitative thresholds for assessing those 3 things. And these have been developed through quite a significant amount of testing. This simplified approach was initially developed in relation to reptiles, and so they've had a head start in terms of testing it and then refining it in terms of some of these quantitative thresholds. But so this is the only well, I say that this is the kind of only taxonomic group for which there are quantitative thresholds, although, as I just mentioned, for birds, they do give quantitative guidance for life history. So more information is given in the guidance on why these thresholds were developed or how they arose, and have been tested quite rigorously with a number of species to ensure that nothing that is of a higher risk or more of a concern gets through the slips through the net. Next slide, please. Module 10, NDFs for tree species. So Module 10 discusses some key concepts in forest management. And these are really important in understanding trade from forest areas. So these general forest management principles are really useful in terms of understanding and understanding how sustainable your forest management and forest harvest is. So there's discussion on these in the module, and it makes specific links from these concepts or to the different modules in 1 and 2, the concepts in mod 1 and 2. The group for tree species decided that for timber species, a simplified assessment was not considered to be suitable, and that if you have export of timber, that you should go straight to a comprehensive assessment. Next slide, please. So these are some of the different steps in forest concession management that are also relevant to making your non-detriment finding and understanding understanding detriment in these concessions. So it's looking at things like understanding the concession area, understanding the access rights, whether there's a forest management plan, and etc., etc. So these are all discussed in detail in that module. Other sources of information. Since the Nairobi meeting, there has been a workshop in Africa, looking at African rosewood, both legal acquisition findings and non-detriment findings, and there are some useful resources, the presentations and experiences shared that can be found through the link there. And there's also a report on the conservation and trade of CITES listed rosewood species, so links to that as well. So those are 2 additional useful resources. During the discussion in the timber work stream, the 9-step timber guidance, NDF timber guidance, which some of you may be familiar with, has been shown to be compatible with the requirements of both module 2 and the concepts in module 10. And here's a table just comparing those. So as Tia had mentioned earlier, if parties wish to follow different approaches, you can be fully you're welcome to follow whichever approach you want, but this is just to reassure you that the 9 steps is compatible with that. On to the next slide, please. NDF for perennial plants. So in this module, it gives some additional details to help apply generic guidance for both the simplified and comprehensive NDF. It gives some specific criteria and qualitative indicators for making simplified NDFs for perennial plants, and there's a table on that in the guidance. It also helps to guide people on how to make NDFs for source code Y for assisted production and how to interpret that. There is a decision tree and a lookup table for evaluating biological risks of wild harvest to individual plants and harvested populations. And there is also, they discussed the 9-step guidance for perennial plants for NDFs, which has also been shown to be fully compatible with module 2. On to the next slide, please. here is that decision tree and lookup table for evaluating biological risks of wild harvest to individual plants and harvested populations. For plants, it's often the case that the whole plant isn't harvested. So this looks at both the impact on the individual plant and the harvested population and combines those two risks into an overall risk to the harvested population. On to the next slide, please. So that's the end of the taxonomic modules, and we've just got a few more to go here. So we're on module 12, online tools and certifications for assisting in NDF making. This module consists of a huge amount of information, giving online tools, directing you to online tools such as species identification, distribution, conservation status, and trade data. This is all information that's going to be useful for making your NDFs. These can help you implement tasks relating to making NDFs, so they can help in suggesting survey methods. And there are also some online tools such as the NDF portal for sharks and rays that allows you to input information to help you work through your NDF for sharks and rays. And there are various other useful tools in this module. It also helps you link to others that might have useful information to help share information and integrate observations so that you can learn from each other. There's also a section on understanding how certification systems can provide information on making NDFs. Quite often, certification systems look at the same aspects that you want to be looking at for your NDF. So it's looking at whether there could be useful information through those to help you. Next slide, please. Templates, module 13. So in module 13, there are some templates for both the simplified assessment and the comprehensive assessment. These are currently only available in PDF at the moment, but the plan is to make them available in Word, which will be much more useful because then you can adapt them or actually fill them in. But remember, these are not prescriptive and therefore you can adapt them to your own needs. And we'll see some case studies later on that. Next slide, please. Module 14 contains a large number of case studies. They've mainly been taken from the work streams and the modules, and they demonstrate various aspects that are discussed in the modules. So there are some case studies on how to make generic NDFs, how to use local and traditional knowledge in making NDFs, and making NDFs for aquatic species, migratory species, etc. And there are a number of case studies using the simplified assessment template, particularly on for a variety of reptile species. Please note that these case studies have been taken from those modules. They haven't been reviewed or kind of necessarily approved as good or bad examples. So please note that. And currently they're only available in English. Finally, module 15, the glossary of key terms and definitions. This includes terms and definitions that are used in the modules that aren't already in the CITES glossary. So this complements rather than replicates that resource. For instance, non-detriment finding is not included in module 15 because it's already defined in the glossary. So that brings us to the end of the guidance document itself. We wanted to quickly go through the CITES NDF Guidance database, that, well, some other things that are available for you to use, particularly the CITES NDF database. Is that slide up? Okay. So to find the CITES NDF database, from the front, the home page of the CITES website, you can scroll down to the bottom to find the virtual college, CITES virtual college button, and that you can see in the next slide. So if you click on the CITES virtual college, that I'm hoping is on your screen with a green circle around it, then you'll get to the next slide, and you will find one of the tabs at the top says NDFs. If you click on the NDFs tab, then you will find a page where you can search for a title or a keyword or a species, and this will bring up any documents or materials that are relevant to that, to your search. You can also, and if you click on one of those, you'll see it gives you some basic information about what that document is about. If you want to do a more comprehensive or a more in-depth advanced search, you are able to use the advanced search tab, which you can see hopefully in red up here in the top left. So you can use your title or keywords. You can use, you can search for a particular life form or taxon or geographical coverage. You can ask for things in a specific language. You can ask for particular types of NDF material. So you might want a case study, or you might want guidance or supporting information, or an NDF. You can ask for export or import related information, or things related to introduction from the sea. And then you can ask for various other things, and you can order these by publication date or different aspects. So we're hoping that if we have some time, which we're looking like we're running out later in the discussion, we might actually just show you around that virtual college and the NDF database section to demonstrate live how it works. So here's an example with prunus, searching for the genus prunus and asking for supporting information and NDFs. And here are the results. It's come up with some NDF, actual NDFs, some reports, background reports, and some other reports. So finally, I wanted to quickly talk about another resource, or another resource for training. There's a CITES Masters program at the International University of Andalusia. This is a master's degree in management and conservation of species in trade. It really does focus on CITES, providing high quality specialized training on the scientific basis, techniques and instruments that enable CITES implementation and development, including training on making NDFs. It has held 15 editions to date, training over 390 students from 106 parties. And some of you may well have, in fact, I know some of you have undertaken this master's course on this call today. It's run every 2 years, partly on campus in Baeza, Spain, and you can find more information on that course through the link to this notification here. So we seem to have run over rather, and everyone's probably dying for their short break. I know I am. We will presumably come back at, should we say 11? Is that going to be enough time to?
So I think we just say 10 minutes
12.
because we had so many different times. I hope you can see it. So we have the case studies.
It's fine, you can make it bigger.
Okay, let me make it a bit bigger. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to go through examples of using the simplified assessment, and then we'll also have some examples of or illustrations of how to use the comprehensive assessment. I'm going to start with the simplified assessments, and just a quick reminder of the schematic presentation that Thomasina spoke about in terms of starting with initial information gathering and using that to determine whether it is a simplified assessment can be done based on low trade volumes, least concern species, etc., taking into consideration the risk, or whether you will do a comprehensive assessment or go through a stepwise process to first do a simplified and then a comprehensive assessment, reaching your conclusions, and then also looking at monitoring and to inform adaptive management as needed. So you recall seeing the schematic and the table during the presentation. We're going to start with a simple case study on Phrynosoma hernandezi, a species that occur in the US, Canada, and Mexico. And we decided to use this one as it's a reptile, and so you will recall that Thomasina highlighted that there's been a lot of work done on reptiles and using the simplified assessment to do NDFs for reptiles. And so they have in the template, the simplified template, they have agreed quantitative thresholds that are included for annual harvest level, area of distribution, and life history. And this specific species, when they considered the information available, they scored the annual harvest level as low. The species is collected mostly for the pet trade, and over a 14-year period, there was only 11 specimens in trade. And so overall, the harvest level was considered to be low and was scored a 1. And so you can score between 1 and 3, depending on whether it's low, medium, or high. In terms of the area of distribution, this species has a wide area of distribution across Canada, the US, and Mexico, about 1.6 square kilometers. And therefore, it was also scored 1 because it has a large area of distribution. In terms of the life history, you can see that it's between 1 and 2. It has a medium to fast life history, or it reproduces annually and give birth to 6 to 13 neonates, but males reach sexual maturity at 1 year, but females from 2 years of age. And so that one was scored between 1 and 2. Considering the conservation or threat status of the species is classified as least concern, and therefore it was scored as 0. And in terms of illegal trade, there was no information, or there's no evidence of illegal trade, and therefore that was scored 0. So the final score was between 3 and 4, so it's below 5. So 5 and above, when you use the simplified assessment, you need to move to a comprehensive assessment. This one was between 3 to 4 total score, and therefore it was found that at the time this assessment was done, that it will not be detrimental to the survival of the species in the wild. And so the case study document then includes the full template, because it's not only this table, you need to provide the justification for your score in the document itself. And so here's a completed case study where all the justifications are included, supporting the score that was given in the table above. So this is a easy example, and I hope it's useful for everyone. And this is really where you have species that's least concern, low trade volumes, widely distributed, etc. So you can do a fairly easy assessment as long as you can provide the justification in the document to support the scores that you've been giving it. Moving on to plants. In module 11, we mentioned that a simplified assessment can be used for perennial plants. And just a quick reminder that at the workshop, when there was discussions about tree species, and especially species where that's harvested for timber, it was advised that a simplified assessment should not be done for tree species that are harvested for timber. But for other perennial plants, you can use a simplified assessment, but acknowledging that it's difficult to put quantitative thresholds, they propose that you consider the table in module 11 that provides more qualitative information. And this is especially true in terms of distribution, where for animals you will consider the area of distribution, area of occupancy, etc. Here it's more looking at distribution, like it's widely distributed, or it's restricted, only occurring in certain areas, or locally restricted or endemic even. So the descriptions are more qualitative, but you can still use the simplified assessment for perennial plants other than tree species that's harvested for timber. And so I just included this table so that you can see what is the difference between the approach for plants for the simplified assessment versus the approach for fauna, for animals. But the same process applies in terms of doing the scoring and the assessment. And a quick reminder that if you have illegal trade data in terms of seizure records, etc., that you should include it in the annual harvest as part of that scoring. And for the threat status, if it is data deficient or unknown, to rather be cautious and score 1. Then also a simplified assessment example that we're using, thanks to Suriname for this example. This is a species, Amazona farinosa, that's been in the review of significant trade process. So Suriname has gone through a process where at some point it was selected at the 29th meeting of the Animals Committee, and for a few years they had a 0 quota while they were doing some further work and as to establish a quota and doing non-detriment findings. So a few things we want to highlight. I'm going to go to the table here. So in terms of annual harvest level, this was scored as low. They harvest less than 200 specimens, or they export less than 200 specimens. And just to note that ideally you would like to look at harvest level, as Thomasina has also emphasized. you would like to look at domestic as well as domestic trade as well as international trade. So the total offtake or harvest should be considered and not only the export numbers. In this case, they considered the annual harvest level to be low and scored it 1. The area of distribution or occupancy is large, and therefore that was also scored 1. And in terms of the life history, it was scored a medium because the birds take about between 4 to 5 years to reach sexual maturity, and the average generation length is 9.56 years. So the life history is sort of in the middle. In terms of the conservation status, it's classified as least concern, and therefore it was scored as 0. And then considering the illegal trade, although the specific seizure records are not available and therefore it wasn't considered in terms of the annual harvest levels, there is some information about illegal trade taking place, illegal harvest, and therefore that was scored a 1. So the final score was a 5. And for this species, they instituted a quota for 200 specimens that is currently in place and was agreed by the standing committee. And if they want to make any changes to that, there should be a process where the Secretariat and the Animals Committee chair is consulted, and it should, of course, be based on the best available scientific information showing that an increase offtake will be sustainable going forward. Again, just to illustrate how they substantiated the information and the findings and the scores that they gave. So giving information in terms of, for example, you can see it's export information that was used. Also important to consider the overall offtake for domestic use as well. The area of distribution, life history information is nicely covered there, as well as, so they indicated that they will need to do a comprehensive assessment because the score is 5 or above. So this is just examples of a simplified one in terms of the reptiles, what you need to consider in terms of plants, and then coming to the example of Amazona, is going through the process. If you score a 5 or higher, then a comprehensive assessment is the way to go. And I'm going to just briefly pause here to hear if there are any questions at this point about the simplified assessment. So this template is available in the module, and you can access that to use it. And of course, the full description is available in the modules on how to use it and how to score it. Okay, I don't
there's one
see
question
any
in the chat.
Okay. Okay, so you can consider global status, but if national status is available, that is of course preferred because that is a I don't know, more accurate, more context-specific assessment and status. So if national status is available, that should be used. Okay, any other questions? Felix, please go ahead.
I would like to know, thank you for the presentation once more. I would like to know, for the simplified NDF, are there specific species it can be applied to, or it could be used for any, it could be used for timber species?
I think the advice at this point in time is not to use it for timber species because that is quite complex in terms of the consideration. So for timber species, no, but for other perennial plants, you can consider it. But you should take into consideration the trade volume. You should take into consideration the specific taxon and the risk to the species or the taxon that you will be trading in. And in general, things that are important to consider is, for example, the three main criteria. So annual harvest levels, if that not too high, because then you will score high. The area of distribution and the life history. So is it K-selected or R-selected species, it's a fast-growing, early sexual maturity, large number of offspring, etc. You need to consider the risk and the vulnerability of the species when you want to do the simplified assessment. It does have built-in precaution in the simplified assessment, because if your annual harvest is high, you're going to score 3 already. If the life history is slow, you're going to score another 3. So it's already 6, which means that you need to do a comprehensive assessment. So there is some precaution built into the simplified assessment, but it depends on the species and the taxon that you're looking at. So it's important to go through a stepwise process, if you prefer, to ensure that you check all these the key elements that could impact the species. But at the moment, the advice is to not use it for timber species and to rather follow the guidance in module 10 and do a comprehensive assessment for timber species. I hope that's clear. Any
Thank you.
other questions?
There's quite a long message in the chat here, but
Yeah,
I think it's more of a comment than a
it's
question.
yeah, I see it's an issue around endorsement of permits, and of course the permit does include an endorsement box where you should record the endorsements. I know there's various challenges that countries are experiencing in terms of that, but I think we note the comment that has been made in that regard. Maybe we'll read through it, Thomasina, while you move on to the comprehensive assessments. I'm going to stop sharing, and I hope this time you will be good. Let's see how it goes.
Fingers crossed. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Oh, phew. That's a big relief.
Success.
Great. Yes, exactly. Right. So I'm just going to talk through a few comprehensive assessment examples today. Given the time that we're at the moment, I might not go into as much detail as I'd originally anticipated. So just a reminder of the comprehensive assessment framework, which is in 2 parts, a risk evaluation part and then impact and management evaluation. And a reminder that this first part, the risk evaluation, really determines kind of the level of detail and data requirements that you might need in considering the next part. So if you've got a very low risk, then you could make still quite a simple, even if it's not the simplified assessment, using less data, fewer data. And then we go on to the management evaluation and potentially the ecosystem impacts evaluation. So in module 13, we also have the comprehensive assessment table. And the table currently looks like this, with at the right-hand side, a column where you can add your information. Scientific authority can put their assessment information and data, etc. But when pulling together the examples that we're going to show now, it's that right-hand column really didn't give you enough space. So in fact, what we've done is taken it and put it below each of the factors that are being considered, so that you can add as much information as needed. So we're using that system for the next few case studies. I've got 3 case studies, and I'm hoping to do them fairly quickly so that there's time for people to ask questions at the end. So the first case study is a case study on on Python Regis from Togo. It is, this was not the format that it originated in. It was a report that you can see here, submitted to SC 78. The species and country combination has been in the RST, and so they had to show how they're making non-detriment findings. And as I said, this is the comprehensive assessment report that was submitted, taken to SC 78. So this case study that I'm about to show you has taken the information from that report and put it into a generic framework template for the comprehensive assessments. It was originally in French, so it's been translated by DeepL, so I apologize for any inaccuracies, and it's been copied verbatim, so it hasn't been amended. It's taken from the report and copied straight, chunks copied straight in. And there are just a couple of additional things that are included in the, that are highlighted in yellow, some information from the red list, and also there are some bits of information from some papers that are already included in the report. So as you can see, this initial data gathering includes various background information that is necessary to be considering when going through the report. And here's the first fact that you consider: species biology and life history characteristics. And there's a number of different things that have been considered here. So such as in the life history traits, would you mind muting your, thank you very much. Great. So this species is a relatively long, sorry, I was off. So the females mature 28 to 32 months, which is really a relatively long period before reproduction starts, which limits the species' ability to compensate quickly for excessive exploitation. It breeds ovipariously with clutch sizes from 3 to 11. And taking into account these bits of information that are included in this section, overall considered that it wasn't a very fast life history, but it was more of a medium. So and there are certain aspects that mean it's not quite as resilient as maybe you would consider. So I'm just trying to demonstrate here. I don't want to go through all the information in detail because otherwise we'll run out of time. But you know, various aspects can be considered within each of these factors and then considered together. So similarly, we're looking at species range. It's very widespread. It's fairly stable over time. So that was given a kind of lower rating, lower risk rating. Again, population structure and status. There's relevant information here saying how it's a very abundant species, and the IUCN Red List assessed it as near threatened. So it's more of a medium. So even though it's very abundant and the population size here is a kind of low risk, going down to conservation status, it was considered more of a medium risk. So going down, looking at different threats, there are a few other threats to the species, and then also looking at some impacts. I think there was some concern that it was a little bit harder to harvest, so you can interpret that as potentially some impacts, negative impacts on the species. But really, overall, things I wanted to flag here with this case study, and you can look through it later at your leisure, was in pulling different bits of information into this framework. It was made it quite clear that the frequency and approach to population monitoring was unclear. So it's therefore quite difficult to assess the impacts on the ground to the species. And I think this is reflected in some of the comments that were made by the Standing Committee 78, which really commended Togo as making fantastic progress on pulling together this information for their NDF, but they requested that there were areas where more information was needed, particularly around the population monitoring, and they've been invited to respond to this over time. So although Togo's conclusion was that it was a positive decision in their report, actually there were, but they had also suggested some conditions. There were some concerns that around the levels that were considered sustainable, and some of the practices that were being used in terms of the harvest and management, as well as some illegal cross-border trade. So it's a framework that can not only help you in determining non-detriment, but it can also help highlight areas where there may be information missing, or that needs strengthening, or that where there are areas that management needs strengthening as well. So I'm going to carry on to another case study, and this is one extracted from a draft NDF by the UK Scientific Authority for Fauna on Strombus gigas, or queen conch, marine gastropod found in the Western Atlantic Ocean. It has got draft written across it because it hasn't yet been fully discussed with all the relevant authorities. So the UK has applied the generic framework and slightly adapted the template from the modules from that in module 13, and assesses different factors separately, and then looks at those overall to come up with a overall assessment for each of the different factors that are in the comprehensive assessment. So for this species, it has a fairly late sexual maturity at 5 to 6 years, but has also a fairly long life history, around 30 years, but possibly up to 40 years. So that was considered low. They produce a large amount of eggs, estimated up to 22 million per year. So that was considered to be a low risk. Some other relevant biological factors that were considered in this. So they've decided that these are factors they feel are important in considering that intrinsic vulnerability. That because they're large and slow moving and occur primarily in shallow bank and coastal environments, they're really accessible to diving fishers. So that was scored as a high. And then they've looked at all of these factors together and overall considered that the intrinsic biological vulnerability of this species is medium. And then similarly, they've looked at different factors under distribution and population status, both the global distribution as well as the local distribution, and global and regional population information, national distribution and population size, and overall considered that in their summary of this factor of distribution and population status, that it's a fairly high risk in terms of where the national or the distribution and population status. They've also looked at both the global red list here and national and local conservation status. There's a link in the document itself to more information on distribution and population status based on both fisheries independent information. So they have done some population monitoring, and more information is found there, and then looked at threats. Quite a lot of other threats they've identified, so things like fishing pressure, which is considered anyway, climate change, habitat loss, contaminants, disease. So again, they've summarised that the conservation status and threats are overall high. They've looked at harvest and trade overview, looking at absolute numbers, but also going down, and you can see looking at catch per unit effort, which is useful fisheries dependent data to help understanding what's happening with the population. And those are two things that are particularly flagged in Module 5, looking at impacts of harvest. It's useful to use fisheries dependent and independent information. In some cases, you might only have the fisheries dependent data to look at. And then overall, because it appears to be a fairly high impact assessment, they've looked down at these mitigating factors about the management and how well that mitigates the risks. But because overall they've considered this is probably detrimental, and we'll go on to that in a minute, or a medium to high risk, they did look at ecosystem impacts. And although they are a key prey species for other species, there was a distinct lack of information on impact on other species and impact on the role in the ecosystem. So I think this was one of the things that was discussed in the working groups, in the work streams on Module 1 and 2, that yes, it's great, everyone would like to be able to assess that, but the reality is there's not huge amounts of information on these kind of impacts. So they concluded that at the moment they were giving it a negative opinion. It's not finalised into a non-detriment finding yet until they've discussed it with all the different players. So they concluded essentially that it was not currently sustainable, and so they have given some recommendations here as to what measures can be put in place to allow future trade, if which these measures should hopefully lead to a positive NDF in the future. Sorry, I rattled through that one quickly, but I'm looking at the time. So I'm going to go on to the fourth case study, which is a tree species from Ghana. And a reminder that when discussing Module 10, they considered that the 9-step guidance for timber was compatible with the CITES NDF guidance. And this is actually a case study from a training workshop on the using the 9 steps as the framework, the 9-step guidance as a framework for this timber species. So this is just highlighting that some parties might be using their own systems already, and that there's nothing in the guidance to suggest that they should cease doing that, but there might be additional approaches within the guidance that parties might wish to use. So this, as I said, this case study is from a 9-step workshop in Ghana on Kaya anthotica. It's a species harvested and exported for timber. A document, a longer document on the case study was prepared, and you'll notice there are some references to it rather than detail being in this, because this is the summary of information here. And this workshop was held in December 2024. So the first few sections are similar to the initial data gathering sections, as you'll see. Are the timber specimens applied for by CITES Appendix 2, covered by CITES Appendix 2? That's similar to the question on are the specimens covered, as we discussed earlier. If we go on down to species conservation status, the species hasn't been assessed globally on the IUCN Red List, and no information was available on a national assessment. So overall, they suggested that it was unknown. And again, with this system, as with the guidance in Module 2, if you've got unknown information, one would treat that as a higher risk and treat it in a more precautionary way. Then looking at potential biological risks or vulnerability and biological characteristics of the species that make species more vulnerable to overexploitation. They've looked at a number of different factors: geographic distribution, national and subnational population size and distribution, size structure. And you can see there's a range of assessments with high and medium. So it's a kind of high medium risk here. And so you'd be wanting to have more information on the next stages of looking at impacts, and both from harvest and trade and management. So again, they go through looking at different factors and impacts in looking at the harvest impacts. So there are certain aspects that really relate to management that I'm going to just highlight here, that because of the minimum cutting diameter, which has been set at 110 centimeters, this is significantly higher than the effective fruiting diameter of 70 centimeters. So this allows for reproduction of the species. A number of trees will be left to reproduce. And there are various other aspects that have meant that actually the harvest impact has been considered unknown to low, low, medium, low, unknown. And similarly, they've looked at trade levels and the impact of those in different at different scales. So in relative to the harvest production area, to the national level, and also looking at overall magnitude of illegal trade. So their next step was to look at different management places in management measures in place. And actually, they're not all pasted in here. Quite a lot are still in the case study. But they then brought all the information that from the assessments in the earlier stages together and tried to look at the impacts in relation to management measures that might mitigate some of those impacts and whether they're appropriate and effective in dealing with them. So I'm just going to scroll to the end, and then the final part is actually making that non-detriment finding, deciding whether it's a negative or positive NDF. And in bringing all the information together in this case and for this area that they considered it was a negative NDF pending additional information and some additional management measures. So they've specifically mentioned what's needed here. They need to have some inventories for forest reserves to help in determining that those impacts, and inventories particularly around regeneration. And then they also suggested other conditions would be that there are some additional safeguards that are going to be decided between the scientific and management authorities and the Forestry Commission. So that I've whistled through rather quickly on those case studies, but knowing that I'm sure you want to have some question time at the end, I'm going to wrap it up now on the case studies. There are a few more slides left over as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomasina. So I'm just going to pause a little bit here and ask if there are any questions about the comprehensive assessment examples that Thomasina presented. As we've mentioned, we will share these in, on the website so that you can have a look at them at your leisure, because we really briefly scanned through them and can see the type of information and data used and how that is then used to inform the advice or decision by the scientific authority. I don't see any hands at the moment. So with that, then I'll go back to the presentation. I don't know, Thomasina, if you wanted to try and show the NDF database, or whether we will wrap up the presentation and then see if there's time to come back. We have about 15 minutes.
Why don't you do those last few slides, okay, and then we can go to that. But there may be further questions. Maybe okay, people are waiting to storing up all their questions till the end.
Good. So with that, I'm going to just go through the last few slides, and that's really next steps what will happen next. And so I mentioned when we started that we had this series of webinars to introduce the guidance materials to the parties and to encourage parties to use it and give us some feedback. So this was the last session that we had. We had 4 webinars, and this was the last one in the series. So we hope you got to, if you didn't, if this is the second or third time you're attending, that's great, but we'll also make it available online, that everyone has the opportunity to listen to it in French and Spanish as well as English. But parties are encouraged to use the NDF guidance and if possible to make some case studies based on the use of the guidance and share that with the Secretariat. That being said, we fully acknowledge that you might have your own processes and methodologies, and please, you can continue to use that as well. But parties that do not have something in place and would like to make use of it are encouraged to do so and share with us your experiences. We're thinking about any practical challenges that you might have in terms of understanding the modules, understanding how to apply the templates, etc. So please reach out if you have some challenges, but please do try and apply them and give us feedback in terms of your experiences. We initially anticipated having another round of webinars, but we will not be able to do so. So what we decided to do is to do a survey. So we will be reaching out to parties through a notification to invite you to complete a survey. It will cover 2 different processes. The one will cover the process to develop the NDF guidance, and the other survey will cover the actual use of the guidance and your experience in terms of using the guidance and whether it covers everything that is essential for you to be able to make NDFs. So we will reach out shortly after the webinars to share the surveys with you, and if you could please complete those, the feedback will be very valuable in terms of not only enhancing the NDF guidance, but also for processes relating to development of guidance like this. We mentioned earlier that this was a collaborative process, and we really would like to see whether that resulted in parties' buy-in and use of the guidance that has been developed through this collaborative process. And the next steps were also discussed by the Animals and the Plants Committee at their joint session in 2024. And they proposed a draft decision that will be considered at the Conference of Parties later this year, relating to getting feedback on the use of the guidance. And in that draft decision, parties will also be encouraged and invited to submit examples on the use of the NDF guidance. And you can also do so through the regional representatives on the Animals and the Plants Committee, so your representatives on the scientific committees, or you can share it directly with the Secretariat. And then the Secretariat will reflect on the information received and the experiences that have been shared with the Secretariat and the Animals and Plants Committee members, and recommend possible updates and amendments to the guidance as needed. We will also consider possible amendments to the resolution 16.7 in terms of whether there's a need to include a mechanism for us to update guidance, such as the modules that we discussed during this session going forward. And then, of course, subject to available resources, we will amend the guidance to be considered by the committees. So these decisions will only be considered at the end of the year by the Conference of the Parties, and that will then inform our processes in the next intersessional period. And I think that is the last slide. Just a big thank you from our side for your attendance and participation. But before we close the session, I would like to ask if there are any other questions or comments that you would like to make. And I want to just get back to Thomasina, whether you want to try and show the database live. We are a bit cautious because of the challenges that we've had in terms of sharing the presentation. But let's see if it's possible so that you can see how to use the database. We did include slides that show you step by step. how to get to it. But yeah, let's see, Thomasina.
Okay, and any questions before I do that?
I don't see any hands at the moment.
And do be reassured that the question sections are going to be removed from the recordings that are posted on the CITES website. So don't feel that I hope that doesn't hold anyone back from asking questions.
I see Megan.
No,
Please go ahead. Megan? Oh, she disappeared.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you for the session. I was just wondering if you're encouraging case studies at like a non-national level as well as a national level, because like I don't work for parties, but we're compiling some information that might be useful to preparing NDFs, and I was just wondering, yeah, if you had any guidance on that, I guess.
No, I think you are welcome to share whatever you do, so that we can have a look. Yeah, so you're welcome to share that as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
And just to add to that, as in the I think it's module 1, it does talk about the geographic scope of your NDFs, and it doesn't necessarily have to be at a national level. It can be at a site level. It slightly depends on whether you're doing a national NDF for maybe a quota or something like that, or whether you're doing an NDF on the basis of a permit where you know where the specimens have come from, which might be there might be very different sustainabilities in different areas within a country. So I think all examples are really useful.
Yeah,
Okay,
also
great.
just to add to that, for module 6, the migratory species and transboundary populations, this is also important, and of course we have shared stocks, etc. So yeah, any information in terms of how you gather data and use that to inform decisions will be good.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other hands, but just to recap, we will put all the frequently asked questions in a document that will be anonymized, and then we'll share that as well with the responses. So that will be also made available after the webinar. Thomasina, you're going to see if you can share. I don't see your screen.
Going to give it a go. I'm going to do it.
Okay.
Right. Yes?
Yes, I can see the CITES website. Awesome.
I don't know what happened before. So frustrating. Right. Okay. So this is really a demonstration just to show what actually we showed earlier on in some of the slides. So to get to the NDF database, you need to first scroll down from the home page to the CITES Virtual College here. And then you'll see up at the top, there's this tab on NDF. So if you press on that, you come to the database. And as I said before, you can you can ask for specific examples, and I'm going to put one in here. Thesaurus. And search for this shark species, mako shark species, and I am going to, so there are 6 materials, there are 5 which are actual NDFs, and then there's one which is guidance, a guidance document here. So I'm going to go into this one, and it tells you a bit about the document. And then if you actually click into the document, you can find a whole NDF case study here. And this is because this one's from the UK, You'll see it's a fairly recognizable format. They've taken the generic guidance and adapted it a little bit, the template, and here's a whole case study that they've put together on the Mako shark. I'm going to do some other, let's get rid of that now. And then if you want to go to advanced search, you can choose particular life forms. So I'm going to choose trees here. And I'm going to choose, oops. And I also want to choose from Africa. And then it comes up with 39 different documents. So some NDF documents, some just background reports, guidance, and you can look through all of those. So if you've got a species that you're doing an NDF for, you can look to see if others have done it, NDFs, and see if their approach can help in your approach. And it might be that they have information on the species which might also be relevant to your NDF. I'm just going to clear these and then just show you, well, actually, it's more of a, you can also choose the most recent, I thought you could choose year, publication year, sorry, going blind. You can choose multiple years. So, so you might want to see what's been done recently and to see if there are any more recent publications. And so these can then be ordered by date, and you can look at to see if they've used the most recent guidance. So I'm just going to click on this guidance for seahorses. It says it was published in 2024, but I think I seem to recall that when I looked at it, actually it was from a report in, some of it was taken from a report in 2016. So I think maybe it was uploaded to the, I think that might be to do with the uploading data, but date. But there's really useful and information in some of these publications to help you in making NDFs. So I'm going to scroll down because there was a whole section on evaluating risks and things. So lots of information in lots of documents on the NDF database. So I would encourage people to not only look at the modules because they're limited in their scope, but also look at some of these resources. If you're starting an NDF and thinking, I'm not quite sure where to go, and I need a little bit of help and reassurance. So there's lots of resources that you can tap into to help you. So anything else anyone would like me to search for or demonstrate while I'm here?
Thanks, Thomasina. I think that is useful for people to see how it works. I don't see any hands. Hopefully people will explore a little bit the website, look at the modules and look at the NDF database. And then we'll get a lot of questions. So I'm just going to, in wrapping up, I'm just going to show the last slide because you can see the, hopefully it will work. The last slide with the general CITES contact information, but you're also welcome to contact the team members that you might know in the CITES Secretariat if you have any questions. But with that, I think we came to the end of our session. I would like to thank everyone for their attendance and participation. We hope you found it useful. We'll be reaching out about the survey to be completed, and we again encourage you to please make use of the guidance and share your experiences with us. We look forward to receive some feedback on your experiences relating to that. So with that, I'm closing the session. I hope you have a wonderful day. Oh, wait, there's a question. I saw a hand briefly coming up, but disappearing. All good. Thanks so much. Thank you for your